Homer and Hesiod tried to explain where the world came, where the universe came from, with a supernatural explanation. The gods did that. And along came, a group called the Milesians, starting with a man called Thales, who was trying to explain the cosmos, the universe, and what goes on in it, not by appealing to some gods and gods controlling things, because if you go back to the mythological stories, if something happened, if a ship was lost at sea, it was because the god of the sea was mad and he made the ship sink. But along came this guy Thales, and he's at least the first one in recorded history who kind of approached it this way. Is he thought that we should be able to explain the existence of the universe by some kind of matter, so that the universe had some kind of material cause. First time anybody thought of it this way. I mean, in modern times, when you ask scientists where did the universe come from, they talk about the Big Bang. It was some kind of physical event that happened. Well, that follows the tradition that Thales started, which is where philosophy got started. That is by trying to explain everything in the universe by its material cause. And we'll talk more about it, but I just wanted you to understand Thales is regarded as the first philosopher. How do we decide that? Well, it looks like the first historian of philosophy was Aristotle. And Aristotle talked about him. And many of the early we call these guys pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratics because they preceded, some of them actually lived at the same time, but most of them preceded Socrates. They got philosophy started before Socrates. So Thales is regarded by Aristotle as the first one, the first philosopher. And I should mention, a lot of these guys, we don't have any of their direct works. We have historical records that they'd actually written stuff. But most of what we learn about them comes from Aristotle and from others reporting about what their views were. So Thales is the first one to try to explain everything by a material cause, and we'll see that that's water. Then along comes a guy named Anaximander, who's reported to be his student, and is following in Thales' tradition. Thales' tradition is, I'm not going to try to explain things the way the poets did, by appealing to supernatural events, but what I'm going to talk about things that I can see, that I can observe. I can see these material things. Now, where Anaximander comes in is, Anaximander, we're going to see, has some criticism of his teacher, if he was his teacher, Thales. That is, he thinks he's going about trying to answer things in the right way, not like the poets. He's trying to give sort of a rational explanation, but he thinks there are problems with the explanation. And following Anaximander, there was another philosopher, another scientist, Anaximenes, who again finds problems with Anaximander's explanation, and we'll look at that in a little bit of detail. That is at least Anaximander's answer to this basic question where the universe came from. But he thinks there are problems. Now notice, I'm give you dates for these guys, and I say these guys are from a place called Miletus, which is in Turkey, which is kind of strange because Turks and Greeks have been contending with each other more or less at least not a physical war, but maybe a war of not being too happy with each other as groups. But we're talking about, this is Greek philosophy starting in Turkey. But keep in mind that whole coast of the Mediterranean, Greece, Turkey, going further, even Italy in those days, they were all Greek colonies. They all spoke Greek. Greece. So these were the first guys to get started. They're also known as the first guys who, the first scientists. And in fact, I had mentioned a guy, Carl Sagan, an astronomer from who used to teach at Cornell, who mentioned he was a guy from Bensonhurst, right here from Brooklyn, and he actually has a series that was done on, I think, by the Discovery Channel called Cosmos. And he spends one of his episodes talking about how these three guys got science started.